You want to stay informed,
Yeah.
right? But wow, sometimes it feels like you need a decoder ring just to figure out what's actually being said, what's really going on.
It really does. Information overload is real.
So today we're trying to cut through some of that noise.
Yeah.
We're looking at recent statements and coverage around Donald Trump, especially how Fox News has presented things compared to, well, other accounts.
Right. And our mission here really is just to give you the core insights. We want to unpack the narratives, look at the evidence mentioned, but, without getting stuck in all the partisan back and forth.
Exactly. We're trying to help you make sense of it.
Yeah, and we've got some interesting source material to work with. Analysis of Fox News coverage, some of Trump's own past statements. We'll be digging into claims about an alleged MS-13 tattoo,
Oh, yeah, that one.
a potential peace summit in Turkey, some, let's say, unique commentary on seatbelts and abortion from Jesse Waters,
Unique is one word for it.
a gift from Qatar, and also some pretty bold claims Trump made about healthcare.
Okay, so quite a bit to unpack. Let's dive in. Where should we start?
Let's start with that MS-13 tattoo story. So the claim was from Donald Trump. He said he saw a photo of someone, supposedly from El Salvador, with MS-13 clearly tattooed right on their knuckles.
Right. And this became a point of discussion when Congressman Swalwell brought it up in a hearing, questioning Homeland Security Secretary Gohmert.
Exactly. And Fox News picked up on this. Laura Ingraham and Byron Donalds were discussing Swalwell's questioning. Now, according to the analysis we looked at, their argument was kind of that Swalwell was being misleading.
How so?
They suggested the photo actually had a caption, like explaining the symbols on the knuckles. Donalds apparently called it a key and essentially accused Swalwell of manipulating the image by calling it doctored.
Okay, so Fox's take was, there's an explanation, Swalwell's ignoring it.
Pretty much. But then you contrast that with Trump's own words from an earlier interview. This was with Terry Moran from ABC.
And what did Trump say then?
He was absolutely definitive. Not it looks like, but it literally says MS-13. He really insisted on it. And when Moran tried to, push back gently, suggesting maybe it's an interpretation of the tattoos,
Yeah.
Trump just sort of dismissed him, seemed almost condescending about it.
So a direct, literal claim from Trump himself.
Right. And that's where the tension really lies. You've got Trump saying literally MS-13, and then the later Fox discussion suggesting it was symbols needing a key.
Which makes Secretary Gohmert's testimony even more interesting. Swalwell asked her directly, point blank, was the photo doctored?
And her response?
She didn't really give a yes or no. According to the source material, she sidestepped, mentioning protocols and the importance of the case being built, repeatedly avoided a direct answer.
That kind of evasion, well, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? If the tattoo clearly said MS-13, like Trump claimed, you'd expect a simple no, it wasn't doctored.
Absolutely. Instead, you get talk about protocols.
So the key takeaway here seems to be the difficulty in pinning down the facts when you have such conflicting assertions, and key figures being evasive when asked directly about the evidence itself. It highlights that challenge for anyone trying to figure out what's true.
Okay, let's shift gears. What about this proposed peace summit in Turkey?
Yes. Trump had suggested this idea, right? A summit involving himself, Putin, and Zelensky to talk peace.
And how was that initially covered?
Well, the Midas Touch analysis points out that Fox News at first framed it as Trump playing, quote, three-dimensional chess. This master negotiator making big moves.
Okay, so high expectations set there. What actually happened?
Well, the reality was less dramatic. Putin apparently said he'd be willing to meet in Turkey. Zelensky said he'd go if Putin was there.
But
in the end, neither Trump nor Putin actually attended the planned talks. There is even a report suggesting Trump was removed from the list once it was clear Putin wasn't coming.
So the big summit with the three leaders just fizzled out.
Pretty much. Zelensky did still travel to Turkey even though Putin wasn't there. Russia sent a delegation, but it doesn't sound like much came of it. Trump's stated goal, remember, was a 30-day ceasefire.
Which didn't materialize from this particular effort.
No. So you see this gap between the initial, maybe amplified, hype, the 3D chess idea, and what actually unfolded.
It really shows how complex international diplomacy is. Things can change fast.
Absolutely. Big pronouncements are one thing, making them happen is another entirely. And it also makes you think about how that initial framing by media outlets can shape perception before the full story is known.
A good reminder to wait and see how things actually play out.
Definitely.
All right, now for something completely different. Jesse Waters' commentary. You mentioned seatbelts and abortion.
Yeah, this was a segment highlighted in our source material. Waters apparently questioned the logic behind mandatory seatbelt laws.
Okay. Where did he go with that?
He made this rather large leap. He suggested that accepting seatbelt mandates could somehow lead down a slippery slope to, well, his example was the government potentially putting abortion clinics in every car.
Wow. Okay. That's
Yeah.
quite a comparison.
It is. The source analysis characterized it as likely unserious, more for shock value than a genuine policy prediction. It's a kind of provocative, slippery slope argument.
And then didn't he just pivot to something else entirely?
Apparently so. Right after that, he asked about the slavery decision, which seems completely unrelated.
So just abrupt shifts in topic.
Yeah, the commentary was described as sort of disjointed, and the source analysis was pretty critical, calling the remarks insensitive and out of touch with real issues people face.
So the takeaway here might be about rhetoric itself, how inflammatory comparisons and maybe illogical leaps are used in commentary.
I think so. It makes you question the purpose. Is it to clarify issues, or more to provoke a strong reaction, even if the arguments don't necessarily track logically?
Food for thought on how we consume commentary. Okay, next. This gift from Qatar. A jet.
Yes, this was an interesting one. Apparently, the government of Qatar gifted a jet to the U.S. government. The idea floated was that it could potentially be retrofitted to serve as Air Force One because of delays with the new Boeing planes.
A whole jet as a gift.
Whole jet. And the Prime Minister of Qatar, who's part of the Royal Al Thani family, reportedly had a very candid take on it. He seemed to kind of shrug off concerns about propriety, suggesting gift-giving, even bribery is just how things work internationally. The quote mentioned was something like, "I bribe you, you bribe us, we bribe."
He actually said that, we bribe.
That was the reported quote, yeah, very direct.
Okay, that's one perspective. What was the reaction noted in the source?
Well, the editor-in-chief quoted in the video expressed concern, pointing out that while that might be acceptable, or at least stated practice, in Qatar, it's considered illegal and unethical in the U.S.
Right. That highlights a pretty significant difference in cultural norms and legal standards when it comes to international relations and gifts.
Absolutely. What's seen as normal diplomacy in one place could be a major ethical issue or even illegal elsewhere.
And what was Trump's reported stance on accepting this gift?
He apparently defended it, saying something like, only a fool would not accept this gift for the country, and noting it was going to the Defense Department.
But there was another detail, wasn't there? About discussion.
Yes, interestingly, the Qatari Prime Minister also mentioned that on the day he was interviewed, he hadn't actually discussed the gift with U.S. officials.
So the gift exists, it's defended, but the direct conversation about it hadn't happened that day, at least according to him.
Exactly. It adds another layer. The whole situation just raises questions about transparency, ethics, and international dealings, and how these cultural differences play out.
Definitely a complex situation. Okay, finally, let's touch on some other statements attributed to Trump. First, this use of Palestinian regarding Senator Chuck Schumer.
Yeah, this was striking. Trump apparently referred to Senator Schumer, who is Jewish, as Palestinian Schumer, and the senator from Palestine.
That seems deliberately provocative.
The analysis we saw certainly framed it that way. The video host expressed confusion and concern, highlighting it as using a nationality as a pejorative against a political opponent. It's definitely loaded language.
And then there were the healthcare claims. What specifically did he say?
He claimed, quite broadly, that he fixed healthcare, and specifically mentioned signing an executive order that supposedly would lower healthcare costs by 90%.
90%. That sounds substantial.
Extremely substantial, but it's crucial to remember the difference between an executive order and actual legislation passed by Congress.
Right. An order doesn't change the underlying laws.
Exactly. And while healthcare costs haven't dropped by 90%, the source material contrasts this with actions taken by the Biden administration, like negotiating some drug prices, which they note faced opposition from some Republicans when it came to extending that to private insurance.
The source also mentioned potential Medicaid cuts.
Yes, it mentioned claims that some Republicans are aiming to, quote, gut Medicaid. And the suggestion from the video host was that Trump's "I fixed it" narrative might be a tactic offering a simple-sounding solution to retain support, without needing complex policy action.
There was also something about cancer drugs.
Right. Trump apparently talked about how expensive cancer drugs are in the U.S. compared to other countries, and then claimed he fix that, too.
So, sweeping claims about major fixes in healthcare.
Very sweeping. And it really underscores how important it is for all of us as listeners and voters to look past the big claims on complex issues like healthcare. You really have to dig into the details, what was actually done, what was the real impact, versus just the statement.
Absolutely. It's easy to say fixed, much harder to actually achieve it, especially with healthcare.
No doubt about it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we've covered quite a range. We looked at that MS-13 tattoo claim and the conflicting accounts.
The difference between assertion and evidence.
The Turkey Peace Summit idea, how the diplomatic reality differed from some initial portrayals.
Yeah, the complexities there.
Jesse Waters' commentary, the use of provocative rhetoric,
Definitely provocative.
the ethical questions around the Qatari jet gift.
Big cultural and legal differences highlighted there.
And finally, these broad claims about fixing healthcare and the use of pretty charged language in political attacks.
Yeah, quite a spectrum of issues, all stemming from recent events and statements.
And it all brings us back to that initial point, doesn't it? Navigating this information landscape.
It really does.
Yeah.
Which leads to, I think, a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over.
Yeah.
In this environment where we're just saturated with competing narratives, different takes on the same event, what are your strategies? How do you personally sort through it all to decide what feels reliable? What evidence do you look for to form your own, informed opinions?
That's a great question. It's not always easy, but thinking about how we evaluate information is probably just as important as the information itself.
Yeah. Exactly. Something to think about.